Imagine yourself floating in a small, dark room, a tiny bubble of life suspended in an infinite, silent void. You are strapped into a simple chair, surrounded by the unfamiliar hum of small fans and the quiet crackle of a radio. Through a small, thick porthole window to your right, you can see something no human being has ever seen before. You see the gentle, perfect curve of the earth. It is a breathtaking, impossible sight. The deep, rich blue of the oceans is a color you have never truly appreciated until this moment. The continents are painted in soft, swirling pastels of tan and green, and the whole world is wrapped in a thin, fragile, almost electric blue halo of its own atmosphere. There are no lines, no borders, no signs of the noisy, complicated world of people below. There is only a silent, peaceful, and beautiful sphere, hanging in the profound blackness of the cosmos. This was the view from the Vostok 1 capsule on the morning of April 12, 1961. And the man inside, the first human to ever witness this sight, was a 27-year-old Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin. His journey was a single 108-minute orbit of our planet, a brief and triumphant flight that changed the world forever. But the story of that flight is so much more than just those 108 minutes. It is a story shrouded in the immense secrecy of the Cold War, a story of a brilliant, anonymous chief designer who had once been a prisoner in a gulag. It's a story of unmanned test flights that ended in spectacular failures, of brave canine pioneers, and of a launch pad disaster so horrific it was hidden from the world for decades. And it's a story that is haunted by persistent, ghostly myths of lost cosmonauts, whose faint, dying whispers were supposedly heard from space. Tonight, we will tell that whole story. This is not just the tale of one man's journey, but a quiet exploration of the entire secret world that made it possible and the strange legends it left behind.
To understand the story of Yuri Gagarin, you must first understand the man who made his flight possible, a man whose name was a state secret for his entire life. He was known only by the title, the Chief Designer. His real name was Sergei Korolev, and his life story is one of the most incredible tales of the 20th century. Korolev was a brilliant and visionary aerospace engineer in the 1920s and 30s. He was a young genius, a leader in the nascent Soviet rocketry program, dreaming of space travel long before it was considered a serious possibility. But his dreams were shattered during the height of Joseph Stalin's Great Purge. In 1938, he was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and sabotage, brutally interrogated and sentenced to 10 years in a hard labor camp, a gulag, in the brutal gold mining region of Kolyma in Siberia. He nearly died there from the harsh conditions and malnutrition. But his story took a strange turn. The Soviet state, even as it was imprisoning its best minds, realized it still needed them for the war effort. Korolev was transferred from the frozen mines of the gulag to a special kind of prison called a sharashka. This was a prison design bureau where brilliant, imprisoned engineers and scientists were forced to work on advanced technology for the state. He spent years working as a prisoner, designing rockets and aircraft, a ghost in his own country's military-industrial complex. After Stalin's death, Korolev was rehabilitated. His charges dropped. He was allowed to return to his work, but his spirit was forever marked by his time in the gulag. He was now a secretive, demanding, and incredibly driven man, with an iron will and an absolute focus on a single goal, reaching space. It was this man, this survivor of the darkest period of Soviet history, who would become the architect of all of their greatest space triumphs. He was a quiet titan, a name unknown to the public, but the single most powerful force behind the Iron Curtain in the race to the stars. The race began in earnest on the evening of October 4th, 1957. On that day, from a remote and secret launch site in the desert of Kazakhstan, a modified R-7 Semyorka intercontinental ballistic missile, a rocket designed by Korolev to carry a nuclear warhead to America, instead carried a small silver sphere into orbit. It was Sputnik 1. As it circled the globe, this tiny 83-kilogram satellite did very little. All it did was broadcast a simple, steady, and deeply unnerving beep, beep, beep on a radio frequency that could be picked up by amateur radio operators all over the world. But the impact of that simple signal was monumental. It was a profound shock to the world, and especially to the United States. The American public had been raised on a belief in their own technological superiority. The idea that the supposedly backward Soviet Union had been the first to place an artificial satellite into orbit was a deep and frightening blow to the national psyche. It created a wave of anxiety that swept the country, a period known as the Sputnik crisis. People worried that if the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could soon launch a nuclear missile from space. The beeping of Sputnik was seen not as a sound of scientific discovery, but as a quiet, ticking threat. This shock spurred the United States into action. The American government poured billions of dollars into science education and research, and in 1958, a new civilian agency was created with the express purpose of catching up to and surpassing the Soviets in space. This was the birth of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The space race had officially begun. It was a competition not just of technology, but of ideologies, a high-stakes global battle for prestige and dominance, all played out against the vast, silent backdrop of the cosmos. And in the early years of this race, Sergei Korolev and the secretive Soviet program were winning.
With the goal now shifted from simply reaching orbit to putting a human being there, both sides began the process of selecting their first space travelers. In the United States, this was a very public affair. NASA introduced its first group of astronauts, the Mercury 7, to the world in a grand press conference in 1959. They were instantly famous, their lives and their training chronicled in detail by magazines like Life. They were the public face of America's space ambitions. The Soviet approach was the complete opposite. It was a process shrouded in absolute secrecy. In 1960, Sergei Korolev began the selection process for the first cosmonaut corps. The criteria were incredibly specific. He needed experienced jet pilots, but they had to be physically small to fit inside the tiny spherical Vostok capsule. They had to be under 30 years old, under 170 centimeters, about 5'7", tall, and weigh less than 72 kilograms, about 159 pounds. And they had to be in perfect physical and psychological health, capable of withstanding the immense stresses of spaceflight. Thousands of pilots' files were secretly reviewed. From these, a group of 20 men were selected to form the first cosmonaut training group. These 20 men, who would later be whittled down to a core group known as the Vanguard 6, were taken to a new secret training center outside Moscow that would later be known as Star City. Here, they began a grueling regimen of physical and psychological training. They were subjected to extreme G-forces in giant centrifuges. They spent days on end in silent, isolated chambers to test their psychological resilience. They practiced parachute jumps and endured intense heat tests. And all of this was done in total secrecy. The identities of these men were a state secret. Their neighbors and even some of their own family members did not know the true nature of their work. They were ghosts, a team of unknowns being prepared in a secret facility for the most audacious journey in human history. The contrast with the celebrity astronauts of the Mercury program could not have been more stark. Before Sergei Korolev could risk sending one of his secret cosmonauts into space, he had to be as certain as possible that the journey was survivable. The Vostok spacecraft and its powerful R-7 rocket were brand new, untested technology. The effects of weightlessness, radiation, and the violent forces of launch and re-entry on a living being were completely unknown. So, like they had with Sputnik, the Soviets turned to the first pioneers of their space program, dogs. This chapter of space history is a quiet and often sad one, but it was a crucial step. The Soviet space program used a number of stray dogs, mostly small mongrels chosen for their resilience and calm temperament, as biological test subjects. The most famous of these, of course, was Laika. In November of 1957, just a month after the first Sputnik, Laika was launched into orbit aboard Sputnik 2. She was the first living being to ever orbit the Earth. Her mission was a one-way trip. At the time, the technology to safely return a spacecraft from orbit had not yet been developed. The Soviet government initially told the world that Laika would be peacefully euthanized after a week in space. But the truth, revealed only decades later, was much sadder. The spacecraft's life support system was rudimentary, and its thermal control system failed. Laika died from overheating just a few hours into the mission. Her flight was a sacrifice, but it proved that a living organism could survive the launch and function in a state of weightlessness, a vital piece of data that paved the way for human flight. The story of the space dogs, however, also has its triumphs. The most famous came in August of 1960. Two dogs named Belka, meaning squirrel, and Strelka, meaning little arrow, were launched into orbit along with a host of other small animals and plants. They orbited the Earth 18 times, and then their capsules successfully re-entered the atmosphere and landed safely. Belka and Strelka became the first living beings to orbit the Earth and return alive. They were global celebrities. Strelka later had a litter of puppies, and one of them, named Pushinka, was given as a gift by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to President John F. Kennedy's daughter, Caroline. It was a small, strange, and quiet moment of connection in the midst of the Cold War. The successful flight of Belka and Strelka was a huge milestone, but it was just one part of a long and often difficult series of test flights for the Vostok program. Between 1960 and early 1961, the Soviets launched a series of spacecraft called Korabl Sputnik, or satellite ship, which were unmanned prototypes of the Vostok capsule that would eventually carry Gagarin. This is where we see the real, documented failed missions that were a core part of the program's development. The very first test flight in May of 1960 was a partial success. The spacecraft reached orbit, but a guidance system error caused it to fire its re-entry engine in the wrong direction, pushing it into a higher orbit instead of bringing it home. It was lost. Just a couple of months later, in July, the next flight ended in disaster. The rocket exploded shortly after launch, tragically killing the two dogs that were on board. These failures were kept as state secrets, hidden from the world. But for Korolev and his engineers, they were vital, if brutal, learning experiences. Then came the triumph of Belka and Strelka in August. But the very next flight in December of 1960 was another terrifying failure. The spacecraft, again carrying two dogs, re-entered the atmosphere at too steep an angle and was destroyed, killing the animals. The pressure was immense. The Americans were moving forward with their Mercury program, and Korolev knew he was in a race against time.
He needed 2 back-to-back perfect test flights before he could get approval to launch a man. In March of 1961, he got them. 2 final Korabl Sputnik missions were launched just a couple of weeks apart. Each one carried a dog and, to test the ejection seat and spacesuit, a life-sized mannequin in a cosmonaut suit nicknamed Ivan Ivanovich. Both missions were perfect successes. The capsules orbited the Earth, re-entered safely, and the mannequins were successfully ejected and landed by parachute. The path was now clear. The technology, though still risky, was deemed ready. The chief designer gave the order to prepare for a human flight.
But even as Korolev's Vostok program was having these successes and failures, the Soviet space effort was overshadowed by a terrible, secret tragedy. This event, which was completely unrelated to the Vostok program but happened during the same critical period, highlights the immense pressure and the dangerous risks of the space race. It is known as the Nedelin catastrophe, and it was the single worst launch pad disaster in the history of space exploration. The story takes place on October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. A new, powerful Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-16, was being prepared for its first test launch. The head of the program, a powerful military figure named Mitrofan Nedelin, was under intense pressure from Moscow to have a successful launch before the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The rocket was rushed to the pad, and safety protocols were ignored. The R-16 used highly toxic and volatile hypergolic propellants. During the preparations on the launch pad, a complex series of technical problems arose. Instead of draining the dangerous fuel and taking the rocket down for repairs, Marshal Nedelin ordered the engineers and technicians to work on the fully fueled live rocket right there on the pad. He even had a chair brought for himself so he could sit nearby and personally oversee the work. It was a catastrophic decision. Sometime during the frantic repair attempts, an electrical short circuit accidentally ignited the rocket's second stage engine. This, in turn, caused the first stage fuel tanks to rupture and explode. The result was a colossal toxic fireball that instantly incinerated everyone on the launch pad, including Marshal Nedelin himself. The exact death toll remains a state secret, but it is estimated that anywhere from 75 to over 150 of the country's top missile engineers and military personnel were killed in an instant. It was a national tragedy of immense proportions. And it was completely covered up. The Soviet government never acknowledged the disaster. The families of the dead were told that their loved ones had died in a plane crash. The world would not learn the true story of the Nedelin catastrophe until the archives were opened after the fall of the Soviet Union.
The story of the Nedelin catastrophe is a somber and quiet one, but it is an essential part of the context for Gagarin's flight. It shows the incredible pressure that the engineers and cosmonauts were under. It shows the culture of secrecy that surrounded the entire Soviet space program, a secrecy that would later fuel the very conspiracy theories we will explore. And it shows the immense risks that were taken on both sides of the space race in the quest to be the first. Every launch was a ride on a controlled explosion, and sometimes that control was lost. But despite this hidden tragedy, Korolev's program moved forward. With his 2 final, successful unmanned flights in March of 1961, he had proven the Vostok system was as ready as it could be. The State Commission gave its final approval. It was time to choose the man who would make the journey. The choice of who would be the first human in space was a matter of intense discussion among the Soviet leadership. The final decision came down to 2 men from the elite Vanguard 6 group of cosmonauts. Both were exceptionally skilled pilots. Both had performed perfectly in their training, but they had very different personalities. The first candidate was German Titov. Titov was highly intelligent, well-educated, and known for being a bit of a poet. He was also seen as being slightly more intellectual, more serious, and perhaps a little more aloof. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant pilot. The other leading candidate was Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin came from a very humble background. He was the son of a carpenter and a dairy farmer from a small village west of Moscow. His childhood was marked by the hardships of the Nazi occupation during World War II. He had worked as a foundryman in a metal factory before his love of flying led him to join the Air Force. He was not an intellectual in the way Titov was, but he possessed something that was perhaps even more valuable for this particular mission: an incredible, infectious, and seemingly unshakable sense of calm and good humor.
Gagarin was famous for his warm, easygoing smile. His fellow cosmonauts recalled that he was a natural leader, someone who remained calm under pressure and who had a knack for putting everyone at ease. He represented the ideal image that the Soviet Union wanted to project to the world: a humble, capable, and charismatic man of the people, a son of farmers and workers who had reached for the stars. In the end, it was this personality that likely tipped the scales in his favor. While Titov might have been slightly better suited for a longer, more complex scientific mission, Gagarin was seen as the perfect ambassador for humanity's first journey into the cosmos. The final decision was kept a secret even from the cosmonauts themselves until the very last moment. Both Gagarin and Titov were prepared for the flight on the morning of the launch. So we arrive at the historic day, April 12, 1961. The location is the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a vast, secret rocket base in the middle of the desolate, flat steppe of Kazakhstan. The morning was cool and a little windy. Yuri Gagarin and Herman Titov woke up early. They had a final breakfast, and then they were both helped into their bright orange SK-1 spacesuits. This iconic suit was, in itself, a marvel of engineering. A self-contained life support system designed to protect the cosmonaut in the event of cabin depressurization or during their ejection from the capsule. They then took a bus ride out to the launch pad. The Vostok rocket, a derivative of the same R-7 missile that had launched Sputnik, stood waiting for them, gleaming in the morning sun. It was fully fueled and venting clouds of super-cold liquid oxygen. There is famous footage of the bus ride showing Gagarin looking calm and smiling, while the chief designer, Sergei Korolev, who was riding with him, looked incredibly pale, tense, and unwell. The weight of the entire mission and of the young man's life was on his shoulders. After arriving at the pad, Gagarin said his goodbyes, gave a small wave to the cameras, and took the slow elevator ride to the top of the rocket, where he was strapped into the tiny spherical descent module of his Vostok 1 spacecraft, which he had nicknamed Lastochka, or Little Swallow. Inside the capsule, it was cramped. Gagarin was strapped into his ejection seat, facing a small control panel with a few simple gauges and a special globe that would show his position over the Earth. His view of the outside world was limited to a small porthole, or visor, optical orientation device, near his feet. For 2 hours, he sat there, listening to the radio chatter as the final countdown proceeded. He was famously calm, his heart rate never rising above a normal 64 beats per minute. He chatted with Korolev over the radio and listened to patriotic music being piped into his helmet. Finally, the moment arrived. The gantry arms pulled away. The launch command was given. In the blockhouse, Korolev's voice, filled with tension, called out, "Liftoff." The 20 engines of the Vostok rocket roared to life, and the rocket began its slow, powerful ascent into the sky. As the rocket cleared the tower, Gagarin, feeling the immense power pushing him back into his seat, famously shouted his informal and jubilant catchphrase over the radio, "Poyakali." It's a wonderfully casual Russian word that simply means, "Let's go." The ride to orbit was violent and loud. Gagarin experienced G-forces over 5 times his normal body weight. He felt the powerful vibrations of the rocket engines and saw the sky outside his porthole turn from blue to deep violet and finally to absolute black. The different stages of the rocket fired and separated, each one giving a powerful kick. Then, after about 11 minutes, the final engine cut off. The crushing weight of acceleration vanished, and Yuri Gagarin was suddenly completely weightless. He was in orbit. He was the first human being to ever leave the planet, and he was completely alone.
The crushing G-forces vanished. The violent roar of the rocket engines was replaced by an unnerving, perfect silence, broken only by the quiet hum of the capsule's fans and the gentle crackle in his headset. Yuri Gagarin was weightless. He was floating. Looking through the small porthole, the visor optical device, he saw it. For the first time in the history of life on this planet, a pair of human eyes were looking back at the world from above. His first words upon seeing the Earth were simple, full of a quiet, almost childlike wonder. "I see the Earth," he reported back to the ground, his voice filled with awe. "The visibility is good. I can see clouds. I can see everything. It's beautiful." The ground station, where chief designer Sergei Korolev was anxiously listening, simply replied, "We hear you, we hear you." What Gagarin saw was a world of impossible color and beauty. He described the horizon as a sharp, stark contrast against the absolute blackness of space. He saw a unique, delicate, multi-layered band of light around the Earth, its atmosphere. He described it as having a gentle, light blue inner layer, which then blended into a deeper ultramarine, then a dark violet, before finally becoming the pure black of the cosmos. It was a view no artist had ever painted, no writer had ever accurately described, because no one had ever seen it before. He was profoundly moved. In his post-flight reports, he would speak about how peaceful and fragile our planet looked from that vantage point. With no borders or divisions visible, it was just a single, unified home for all of humanity. In those first few minutes of his flight, Gagarin was not just a pilot or a cosmonaut, he was a poet, the first emissary of a new, cosmic perspective for our species. He was trying to find the words to describe the indescribable, all while floating in a tiny metal sphere, a single, lonely man in the vast, silent cathedral of space. His journey was a single, swift orbit of the planet, lasting only 108 minutes from launch to landing. After entering orbit over Siberia, his Vostok 1 capsule, which he had nicknamed his Little Swallow, traveled eastwards across the vast, icy expanse of the Russian Far East and out over the Pacific Ocean. This was a long, quiet stretch of his journey. As he crossed the Pacific, the sunlit world below him, he was out of direct radio contact with the Soviet ground stations. He was truly on his own. He continued to make observations, speaking into his onboard voice recorder, describing the view. He noted the way the oceans looked, the patterns of the clouds. He was a test pilot, and this was a test flight. His job was to observe, to report, to be the first human sensor in this new and strange environment. He then crossed the equator and flew over the southern tip of South America near the Strait of Magellan. The continent would have been shrouded in the darkness of pre-dawn. As his orbit carried him on, he flew into the Earth's shadow. For the first time, a human being experienced a sunset from space. He described it as a rapid, beautiful transition, with the horizon glowing in brilliant shades of orange, red, and then deep violet before plunging into total darkness. On the night side of the Earth, he could see the distant, unwinking lights of the stars, but he could not make out the lights of any cities below. Then, as he flew over the Atlantic Ocean, he experienced his first orbital sunrise. He described it as a sudden, brilliant flash of light, a burst of incredible color and energy as the sun's rays appeared over the curved horizon. His orbit then carried him over the continent of Africa, across the desert sands of Egypt, and over the Mediterranean, as he began to prepare for the final and most dangerous part of his historic flight, the return to Earth.
During these 108 historic minutes, Gagarin was not just a passive passenger admiring the view. He was a scientist and an engineer, tasked with a series of simple but vital experiments to understand how a human being would function in this new environment. His first task was simply to observe his own body. Was he feeling dizzy? Was he nauseous? Could he think clearly? He reported back to the ground that he felt excellent, that weightlessness was a pleasant and interesting sensation, and that he was adapting well. He was also tasked with attempting to eat and drink to prove that the digestive system worked normally without gravity. The food provided was, of course, in tubes. He had one tube of pureed meat and another of chocolate sauce. He dutifully squeezed the contents into his mouth and reported that the process of eating and swallowing felt completely normal. He also drank some water from a similar tube. These simple acts were a crucial part of the mission, proving that future cosmonauts could be sustained on longer flights. He also had a logbook and a pencil to record his observations. But here, he encountered one of the small, funny realities of zero gravity. At one point, his pencil floated away from him and he couldn't find it. It just drifted off into a corner of the capsule, lost for the rest of the mission. This tiny incident highlighted how everyday objects behave in unpredictable ways in space. But perhaps the most telling detail of the Vostok 1 mission was related to the spacecraft's controls. The Vostok capsule was almost entirely automated. The flight plan was pre-programmed, and the re-entry sequence was designed to be triggered automatically by a timer. The engineers on the ground, led by Sergei Korolev, were not yet fully confident that a human could function reliably in this strange environment of space. They worried that a cosmonaut might become disoriented or incapacitated. So, they locked the manual controls of the spacecraft.
Gagarin was, in essence, a passenger in his own ship. He was there to observe and report, but not to fly. However, the engineers knew that something could go wrong with the automated systems, and that Gagarin might need to take control to save himself. So they devised a clever, if slightly paranoid system. A special 3-digit code was needed to unlock the manual controls. This code was not given to Gagarin before the flight. Instead, it was placed inside a small, sealed envelope that was stored in the cockpit. Gagarin was only supposed to open the envelope and use the code in the event of a dire emergency. It's a fascinating insight into the mindset of the time. The engineers trusted their machines more than their man. They wanted to ensure that the pilot wouldn't interfere with the automated systems unless it was absolutely necessary. As it happens, several people, including Korolev himself, quietly broke protocol and told Gagarin the code before the flight. just in case. They trusted him, even if the official procedures did not. The code, by the way, was 125. Thankfully, Gagarin never needed to use it, though as we'll see, the automated system that he was supposed to trust was far from perfect. As his single orbit neared its end, the automated systems began the sequence for his return to Earth. As the Vostok 1 capsule flew over the west coast of Africa, the spacecraft oriented itself, and at the precisely calculated moment, its liquid-fueled retro-rocket engine fired. This was the critical brake firing, designed to slow the spacecraft down just enough for it to fall out of orbit and begin its long, fiery plunge back into the atmosphere. The engine burn was successful. Gagarin was on his way home. But then things started to go wrong.
The Vostok spacecraft was made of two main parts. There was the spherical descent module, the small swallow in which Gagarin lived, which was protected by a thick heat shield. And then there was the service module, which was attached to the back. The service module contained the retro-rocket engine, the batteries, and the oxygen tanks. After the retro-rocket had fired, the service module was supposed to detach and fall away, leaving only the spherical descent module to re-enter the atmosphere. But on Vostok 1, it didn't detach properly. A bundle of 4 thick metal straps that held the two modules together failed to release. So, as Gagarin's capsule hit the upper layers of the atmosphere, it was still attached to the heavy, unnecessary service module. This was a terrifying and completely unexpected situation. The combined spacecraft was now aerodynamically unstable. It began to tumble violently, spinning end over end as it was gripped by the thickening atmosphere. Inside the capsule, Gagarin was being subjected to immense G-forces as high as 10 Gs, pinning him to his seat. At the same time, his world was spinning uncontrollably. Through the porthole, he saw the fiery plasma of re-entry swirling around him. He later reported that he saw the purplish glow of the heat and heard the capsule's structure crackling as the temperature outside soared to thousands of degrees. He was a passenger in a fiery, spinning, out-of-control vehicle. He gripped his controls, but there was nothing he could do. He just had to wait and trust that the engineering would hold. For nearly 10 long minutes, the capsule tumbled and spun. Gagarin remained incredibly, almost inhumanly calm. He continued to report his status to the ground, his voice showing no signs of panic, even though he believed he was likely about to die. Then, finally, the intense heat of re-entry did what the separation mechanism had failed to do. It burned through the thick metal straps. With a violent jolt, the service module was torn away.
Freed from the dead weight of the service module, the spherical descent module immediately and thankfully stabilized itself. A sphere is a naturally stable shape for re-entry, and the capsule automatically oriented itself with its heaviest part, the side with the heat shield, facing forwards. The violent tumbling stopped. Gagarin was now on a stable, if incredibly steep, ballistic trajectory towards the ground. The worst of the crisis was over. But the final strange act of his journey was still to come. The Vostok capsule was a brilliant piece of engineering, but it had one major design flaw. Its landing was very, very rough. Unlike the American capsules, which were designed to splash down gently in the ocean, the Vostok was designed to land on solid ground, and it hit hard. So hard, in fact, that it was considered too dangerous for a cosmonaut to be inside it at the moment of impact. So the mission plan called for a unique and dramatic landing sequence. The cosmonaut was never intended to land with their capsule. At an altitude of about 7 kilometers, or about 23,000 feet, while the capsule was still descending under its main parachute, the automated systems would trigger another explosive event. The main hatch of the capsule would be blown off. 2 seconds later, the the ejection seat that the cosmonaut was strapped into would fire its own rockets, blasting the pilot out of the falling sphere and into the open air. So, after surviving the launch, the cold of space, and a fiery, tumbling re-entry, Yuri Gagarin's final trial was to become a parachutist. The system worked perfectly. He was ejected from his capsule and began his own, separate descent under his personal parachute. For a few brief moments, the sky over the quiet Russian countryside was filled with a strange sight. Two objects descending under two different parachutes, the empty, scorched Vostok capsule and a single man in a bright orange spacesuit.
During his parachute descent, Gagarin had another small scare. His reserve parachute partially deployed in addition to his main one, and he had to struggle to keep them from getting tangled. He also had trouble with a valve on his helmet that was supposed to allow him to breathe outside air, and for a few tense moments he worried he might suffocate just a few thousand feet from the ground. But he managed to get it working. He finally landed safely in a freshly plowed field near the Volga River, not far from the city of Saratov. It was a quiet, rural area. There was no official welcoming committee, no television crews. The first people to see the first human to return from space were a local farmer, a woman named Anna Tokhtarova, and her young granddaughter, Rita, who had been planting potatoes. They saw this strange figure in a bulky, bright orange suit with a large white helmet walking towards them across their field. They were understandably terrified. They had never seen anything like it. They started to back away. Gagarin, seeing their fear, raised his visor and gave them his famous warm smile. He called out to them, his voice muffled by his helmet, "Don't be afraid. I am a Soviet citizen just like you. I have descended from space and I must find a telephone to call Moscow." It was a wonderfully surreal and humble end to one of the most audacious journeys in human history. The first man in space, his mission complete, standing in a farmer's field asking for directions to the nearest phone. The official story of Yuri Gagarin's flight was one of perfect, triumphant success. The Soviet Union for years concealed the problems with the tumbling re-entry and the fact that he had landed separately from his capsule, as they feared it might disqualify his flight from being an official world record. But the true story, with its quiet moments of near disaster and its strange, humble ending, is in many ways even more incredible.
And now our story takes a strange and shadowy turn. The official history of Gagarin's flight is a powerful one, but because the Soviet space program was shrouded in such intense secrecy, it created a vacuum of information. And into that vacuum, a host of other, darker stories began to grow. These are the persistent myths and conspiracy theories of the lost cosmonauts, tales of secret failed missions, and the ghostly voices of dying men and women heard from space. For our quiet exploration tonight, we will treat these stories not as fact, but as a fascinating kind of Cold War folklore. They are a product of their time, born from the fear, the mystery, and the propaganda of the space race. Understanding these myths is just as important in a way as understanding the true history, because they show us the powerful grip that the mystery of space had on the human imagination during that tense era. The main source for almost all of these stories comes from two amateur radio enthusiasts in Italy, the brothers Achille and Giovanni Battista Giudica Cordiglia. In the late 1950s and early 60s, from a repurposed German bunker near Turin, which they named Torre Bert, the two brothers had assembled an impressive homemade listening post. They were skilled radio operators, and they were obsessed with tracking the secret Soviet space missions. They claimed that with their sensitive equipment, they were able to pick up not just the telemetry and beeps from Soviet satellites, but also something much chilling: radio transmissions from crewed space flights that the Soviet Union never announced. Over several years, they released a series of audio recordings that they claimed were the faint, dying whispers of cosmonauts lost in space on secret, failed missions that happened before Yuri Gagarin's celebrated flight. These tapes became the foundation of the lost cosmonaut legend.
Let's take a quiet, atmospheric tour through some of the most famous and chilling of these alleged recordings. We will listen to the stories as they have been told by proponents of the theory for decades. One of the first and most dramatic recordings was allegedly captured in November of 1960, 5 months before Gagarin's flight. The brothers claimed to have picked up a faint, repeating signal in Morse code. It was an SOS message, the universal signal of distress, coming from a spacecraft that seemed to be moving slowly away from the Earth. The implication was clear. They were listening to a Soviet spacecraft that had suffered a malfunction and was now drifting helplessly out into deep space. The signal eventually faded away, and the craft and its crew were never heard from again. A few months later, in February of 1961, just 2 months before Gagarin, they claimed to have recorded something even more unsettling. They released a recording that they said captured the sound of what appeared to be a human heartbeat and labored, failing breathing coming from an orbiting spacecraft. They tracked the signal as the spacecraft moved across the sky, the heartbeat reportedly growing weaker and more erratic with each pass, until finally it stopped. The story was that this was a secret mission that had gone horribly wrong, another victim of the space race hidden by the Soviets.
These recordings, and several others like them, painted a grim picture of the Soviet space program. They suggested that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space, but merely the first one to survive. They implied that the path to his historic flight was paved with the secret deaths of a number of lost cosmonauts whose missions had failed and whose very existence had been erased from history by a ruthless and secretive state. It was a powerful and compelling narrative, and for many people around the world during the Cold War, it seemed entirely plausible. But now, let's take a quiet step back and look at this story from a different perspective, the perspective of a historian weighing the evidence. For all their drama, the recordings of the Giudica Cordiglia brothers are riddled with serious problems and inconsistencies that have led most mainstream historians and space experts to conclude that they are not authentic. Let's start with the language. When Russian speakers have listened to the recordings, particularly the one of the woman burning up, they have consistently pointed out that the Russian spoken on the tape is unnatural. The grammar is sometimes incorrect, the sentence structure is awkward, and the speaker uses some non-standard phrases. It sounds less like a native Russian speaker in distress and more like someone who is not a fluent speaker, perhaps reading from a script. Then there are the technical problems. The orbital data that the brothers released for some of their alleged signals doesn't line up with the laws of physics. Some of the trajectories they described are almost impossible to achieve. Furthermore, the Soviet Union, for all its secrecy, was being monitored by a vast network of sophisticated listening posts run by the United States government, including the National Security Agency. These professional intelligence agencies, with equipment far more powerful than the brothers' homemade setup, have never reported intercepting any of these alleged tragic signals.
It seems unlikely that two amateurs in Italy could hear something that the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus missed.
Many of the specific sounds on the tapes have also been given more mundane explanations. The fading heartbeat, for example, sounds very similar to the telemetry data from a Soviet space probe that was monitoring a dog's heartbeat. And some of the other transmissions are a close match for the signals from a regular unmanned Zond probe. It's entirely possible that the brothers were indeed picking up real Soviet transmissions, but that they were misinterpreting what they were hearing, perhaps caught up in the excitement and mystery of the space race and allowing their imaginations to fill in the gaps. This doesn't mean we should dismiss their story entirely. It is a fascinating piece of Cold War history in its own right. It shows how the intense secrecy of the Soviet program created a fertile ground for these kinds of myths to grow. In the absence of real information, people will always create their own stories, and the story of the lost cosmonauts was a powerful one. But there is another major Roswell-like conspiracy theory surrounding the first man in space, one that is a little more specific. This is the story of Vladimir Ilyushin. The theory goes like this. Vladimir Ilyushin was a real, highly decorated Soviet test pilot, and he was also the son of a very famous and powerful aircraft designer, Sergei Ilyushin. The conspiracy theory, which first emerged in a Western newspaper in 1961, just days before Gagarin's flight, claims that it was Ilyushin, not Gagarin, who was the first man to secretly fly into space on April 7, 1961. According to the story, Ilyushin's mission went terribly wrong. His capsule supposedly malfunctioned during re-entry, and he made a hard landing in China, where he was severely injured and taken into custody by the Chinese authorities. The Soviet Union, so the story goes, could not admit this catastrophic failure, so they covered the whole thing up, and just 5 days later, they quickly sent up Yuri Gagarin on a perfect textbook flight, presenting him to the world as the first man in space, while Ilyushin was hidden away, recovering from his injuries.
It's a very dramatic story, and it has persisted for decades in some corners of the internet. But like the Judica Quidiglia tapes, the story of Vladimir Ilyushin as the first cosmonaut falls apart under quiet historical scrutiny. The original source of the story was a British communist newspaper correspondent in Moscow who had a reputation for sensationalism. There is no official record, either from the declassified Soviet archives or from Western intelligence sources, of any Soviet launch happening on April 7, 1961. And what of Vladimir Ilyushin himself? He was a real person, and he was indeed severely injured in 1961. But his injuries were the result of a car crash, which happened on Earth in June of that year, not from a space mission in April. Ilyushin himself, before he passed away in 2010, always patiently and consistently denied the story, reportedly with a good deal of amusement. He was a celebrated test pilot, but he was never part of the cosmonaut program. The myth of the lost cosmonauts, in all its forms, is a powerful one because it taps into our suspicion of official stories and our fascination with hidden secrets. But the true story of the Soviet space program is, in many ways, even more dramatic and compelling. There were real failures, there were real deaths, like in the Netherlands catastrophe, and there were real, terrifying near disasters, like Yuri Gagarin's own tumbling re-entry. The truth of the immense risks these real people took is, I think, a much more powerful story than any myth. And this brings us to our final chapter tonight. Let's leave the myths and conspiracies behind and have one last quiet reflection on the man himself and the legacy of his single, historic orbit.
Yuri Gagarin's flight on April 12, 1961, was a moment that shifted human history. In just 108 minutes, he redrew the boundaries of our world. He became, overnight, the most famous person on the planet. His journey was a colossal victory for the Soviet Union in the Cold War, a demonstration of their technological prowess that sent another wave of shock and determination through the American space program, directly leading to President Kennedy's commitment to land a man on the moon. After his flight, Gagarin was not allowed to fly into space again. He was considered a national hero, a living symbol, too precious to risk on another dangerous mission. He became an ambassador for the Soviet Union, traveling the world, where he was greeted by enormous, adoring crowds. His warm, charismatic personality and his famous, easy smile made him incredibly popular everywhere he went. He was a humble man from a simple background who had touched the stars, and he embodied the romance and wonder of the dawn of the space age. Tragically, his life was cut short. In 1968, while piloting a routine training flight in a MiG-15 fighter jet, his plane crashed and he was killed at the age of just 34. His death was a national tragedy, and his ashes were interred in the walls of the Kremlin in Moscow, one of his country's highest honors. The legacy of his flight is immense. He was the first. He was our species' first messenger to the cosmos, the first to see our planet as it truly is, a small, beautiful, and fragile home in a vast and silent universe. His journey was a triumph of engineering, born from the brilliant and tortured mind of Sergei Korolev. And it was a triumph of human courage, a quiet bravery in the face of incredible and often unknown risks. So why, then, have the strange, ghostly myths of the lost cosmonauts persisted for so long, even when the evidence for them is so thin? I think the answer is a quiet and important one. These stories were born from the intense, almost paranoid secrecy of the Soviet program.
In the absence of clear, open information, we as human beings will always create our own stories to fill the void. The Soviet Union's refusal to acknowledge its failures, like the Nedelan catastrophe or the failed unmanned launches, created a fertile ground for suspicion. If they were hiding those things, it seemed perfectly plausible to people in the West that they would also hide the deaths of their cosmonauts. The myths, in a way, were a natural and predictable consequence of the very secrecy that was meant to project an image of Soviet perfection. And they tap into a powerful narrative. The idea of a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, unheard and unacknowledged by the powerful, is one of the oldest stories we have. The thought of a cosmonaut dying alone in the cold of space while their government denies their very existence is a heartbreaking and compelling tragedy. It's a much more dramatic story than the quiet, methodical, and often boring reality of engineering and test flights. But the true story, I think, is the most powerful of all. The real failures, the real setbacks, and the real near disasters that we know happened make the final success of Gagarin's flight even more incredible. The quiet courage of the real cosmonauts and astronauts who knew the risks were immense but strapped themselves into those tiny capsules anyway is more inspiring than any ghost story. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let the quiet story of Yuri Gagarin be a soothing presence. Think of that young man, with his famous smile, sitting alone in his small spherical capsule, looking out at our world for the first time. Think of the beauty and the wonder of that moment, and the quiet courage it took to get there. It is a true story, and sometimes those are the very best kind. Sweet dreams.
Let's linger for a moment longer on the man himself, Yuri Gagarin. What was it about him that made him the chosen one? The selection process for the first cosmonaut was incredibly intense. Out of the original 20 candidates, the group was whittled down to the elite Vostok 6. And out of those 6, it became clear that the choice was really between two men, Gagarin and German Titov. On paper, Titov was in many ways the more qualified candidate. He was from a more educated background, the son of a school teacher. He was known for being a bit of a poet, for being more intellectual, and for his almost perfect performance in the training exams. He was serious and deeply competent. Gagarin, on the other hand, was the charismatic everyman. His humble origins were seen as a huge asset from a propaganda perspective. He was the son of a collective farm worker who had lived through the Nazi occupation. He was warm, he was funny, and he had an infectious, easygoing nature. But he was also an excellent pilot and incredibly cool under pressure. There's a famous story from their training where the candidates were put into a silent, soundproof isolation chamber for days on end to test their psychological stability. Gagarin reportedly handled the intense solitude with remarkable ease, humming songs to himself and seeming completely untroubled. Another factor was his physical size. He was very small, only about 157 centimeters, or 5 feet 2 inches tall. This was a significant advantage for fitting into the incredibly cramped Vostok capsule. But ultimately, the decision may have come down to the simple matter of personality. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, reportedly had a deep affection for Gagarin's sunny disposition, and the head of cosmonaut training, Nikolai Kamanin, noted in his diary that the only thing holding him back from choosing Titov was that he wanted to save the stronger man for a more complex one-day flight. Gagarin was chosen for the single orbit. It was a decision that would cement his name in history forever.
Let's also explore the Vostok capsule in more detail. It was a remarkable, if slightly crude, piece of machinery. The official name was Vostok 3KA. It consisted of two main parts. The part the cosmonaut rode in was the spherical descent module. It was just over 2 meters in diameter, a tiny, cramped space packed with the ejection seat, control panels, and life support systems. The spherical shape was chosen for a reason. It is inherently stable upon re-entry. No matter how it tumbles, it will naturally orient itself with its heavy base forward, ensuring the heat shield takes the brunt of the heat. But this also meant it couldn't generate any lift, leading to the rough, high-G ballistic re-entry. The second part was the service module. This was a cone-shaped section attached to the back of the sphere. It contained the battery systems, the oxygen and nitrogen tanks for the life support, and the small liquid propellant retro-rocket engine needed to deorbit. This module was not designed to survive re-entry and was supposed to be jettisoned. The capsule had 3 small portholes. One was above the cosmonaut's head, and 2 were on either side of his feet. The main optical device for viewing the Earth, the visor, was located on the floor between his legs. This meant that to look at the Earth, Gagarin had to look down, which must have been a strange and disorienting perspective. The entire system was built for simplicity and redundancy where possible, but it was also built with the understanding that this was an incredibly risky, almost experimental flight. There was no launch escape system to save the cosmonaut if the rocket failed in the first few seconds of launch. The ejection seat could only be used after the rocket had reached a certain altitude. It was a testament to the immense risks that were considered acceptable in the frantic early days of the space race.
Let's talk more about that tumbling re-entry. The failure of the service module to separate properly was a major and terrifying malfunction. The 4 metal straps that held the 2 modules together were designed to be released by a series of explosive bolts. For some reason, these bolts fired, but the straps didn't fully release. So, Gagarin's capsule was re-entering the atmosphere with a huge, dead piece of equipment still attached to its back, held on by a tough umbilical cord of wires and plumbing.
The aerodynamics of this combined shape were terrible. It immediately began to spin and tumble violently. The G-forces were immense and unpredictable, fluctuating wildly as the craft spun. Gagarin reported feeling G-forces of over 10 times his body weight. This is the very edge of what a human can withstand before blacking out. He was being crushed into his seat while simultaneously being tumbled like a sock in a dryer, all while a fireball of plasma raged outside his window. He knew something was wrong. In his post-flight debrief, he calmly stated, "The spacecraft began to spin. I reported to Earth that the separation had not occurred." He was convinced he was about to die. He thought the violent tumble would prevent his parachute from deploying correctly. But he remained a professional to the very end, reporting his status and not showing any panic in his voice. The problem, as we said, was solved by the intense heat of re-entry itself. After about 10 long, agonizing minutes, the heat finally burned through the remaining cables and straps, and the service module was ripped away. The spherical descent module, now free, immediately found its stable orientation. It was a moment of incredible, unexpected salvation. The very fire that threatened to destroy him had, in fact, saved his life. It's one of the great, quiet, near-disaster stories of the space age.
Now let's consider the landing in more detail. The fact that the Vostok cosmonaut had to eject and land separately from their capsule was a closely guarded secret by the Soviet Union for many years. Why? Because the international organization that ratifies aviation and spaceflight records, the FAI, had rules at the time that stated that for a flight to be considered official, the pilot had to land with their craft. The Soviets, wanting to secure Gagarin's flight as an official world record without any ambiguity, simply lied about this part of the mission for years. They edited their films and their reports to give the impression that Gagarin had landed inside the Vostok 1 capsule. It was only many years later that the true details of the landing sequence were officially acknowledged. And that first encounter on the ground is a wonderful story in itself. The farmer, Anna Taktalova, and her granddaughter Rita were out planting potatoes in a collective farm field near the village of Smilovka. Suddenly, they heard a loud boom and saw a huge, round metal ball crash into a nearby ravine. A few moments later, they saw a figure in a bright orange suit descending under a white parachute. As this strange figure landed and walked towards them, their first reaction was fear. It was 1961, the height of the Cold War. They had no idea who or what this was. Their first thought was that it might be a foreign spy who had been shot down. As Gagarin got closer, he tried to reassure them. He shouted, "I am a friend, comrades, a friend." He explained that he was a Soviet citizen, and they slowly realized they were talking to a pilot of some kind. It was only when the military recovery teams arrived by helicopter a short while later that they understood the true historic nature of their strange visitor. They were the first people on Earth to welcome home the first man from space.
Let's return one last time to the lost cosmonaut myths, and specifically to the Judica Cordelia brothers. The context of their work is important. They were not professional scientists, but passionate amateur radio hobbyists. They were true pioneers of a kind of citizen science, using their own ingenuity and homemade equipment to listen in on the secret world of the space race. Their dedication was incredible. They had built a network of antennas and tracking equipment that was, for an amateur setup, very impressive. And it's very likely that they were picking up real Soviet signals. The problem lies in the interpretation. The Soviet Union launched dozens of unmanned probes, scientific satellites, and test flights during this period, many of which failed. The telemetry from these missions, which included things like biological data from the space dogs, could sound very strange and could easily be misinterpreted by someone who did not have the key to decipher the codes. For example, the famous recording of the woman's voice burning up on re-entry has been analyzed by many experts. The cadence of the speech, the words used, and the background noise all suggest that it was not a live transmission from a person in distress. The language is very formal and declarative, more like someone reading a report. It's thought that it could have been a pre-recorded test transmission, broadcast from a satellite to test the communication links, or perhaps a misinterpretation of telemetry data. The story of the brothers is not necessarily a story of a hoax, but perhaps a story of confirmation bias. They were two young men caught up in the excitement and paranoia of the Cold War who desperately wanted to uncover a great secret. It's possible that they interpreted the ambiguous static-filled signals they heard through the lens of what they expected or even hoped to find. Their story is a fascinating footnote, a testament to the power of mystery to shape our perception of reality.
And now, for the final time, let's consider the myth of Vladimir Ilyushin. This story has a much more specific origin. It was first published by a British communist journalist named Denis Ogden. He claimed to have sources in Moscow who had told him about the secret failed flight. The story was then picked up by a French journalist, and it spread from there. It was, from the very beginning, a product of Cold War rumor and journalism, not scientific evidence. The core of the story relies on the fact that Ilyushin was indeed seriously injured in 1961. But there is substantial evidence, including interviews with Ilyushin himself and official records, that his injuries were from a car crash that happened in June of that year, 2 months after Gagarin's flight. The proponents of the conspiracy theory claim that this car crash was just a cover story to explain the injuries he sustained during his failed space mission. But the theory has major technical holes. The Vostok spacecraft was designed for a ballistic re-entry and a parachute landing on Soviet soil. The idea of it somehow going off course and landing in China, as the theory claims, is technically almost impossible given the orbital mechanics. Furthermore, no evidence of any Soviet launch on or around the alleged date of April 7, 1961 has ever been found in any declassified Soviet or Western intelligence archives. The Ilyushin story is a compelling what-if, a classic conspiracy narrative with a secret hero and a massive cover-up. But like the Giudica Cadiglia tapes, it seems to be a myth born from the intense secrecy of the Soviet program. The lack of transparency created a void, and that void was filled with fascinating, but ultimately unfounded stories. The true story of the risks, the real failures of the test program, and the near disaster of Gagarin's own flight is a much more complex and I think a much more human tale.
Let's now take a quiet moment to consider the spacecraft itself in greater detail. The Vostok capsule was a sphere, which is a very interesting choice. The American Mercury capsule was a cone. The reason for the sphere was, in large part, simplicity and robustness. A sphere has no wrong way to re-enter the atmosphere. No matter how it tumbles, its aerodynamics are essentially the same, and it will naturally stabilize with its heaviest point, the base with the heat shield, facing forward. This removed the need for a complex and potentially fallible attitude control system for re-entry. It was a simple, elegant solution. However, it came with a major drawback. Because a sphere cannot generate any aerodynamic lift, it follows a purely ballistic trajectory. This meant the re-entry was much steeper and subjected the cosmonaut to much higher g-forces, up to 10 Gs, which is at the very limit of human tolerance. The American capsules, with their conical shape, could generate a small amount of lift, allowing for a gentler, more controlled re-entry with lower g-forces. The interior of the Vostok was famously Spartan. The cosmonaut was strapped into a large ejection seat that took up most of the cabin space.
The control panel was simple. One of the most interesting features was a small mechanical globe on the dashboard. This globe would rotate in sync with the capsule's orbit, showing the cosmonaut which part of the Earth they were flying over at any given time. It was a clever, low-tech navigation device in an era before digital screens. The life support system was also simple. It provided a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen at normal sea level pressure, unlike the American capsules, which used a pure oxygen low-pressure environment. This made the Soviet system less of a fire risk, but it also made the spacecraft much heavier, as it had to be built to withstand the higher internal pressure against the vacuum of space. Every design choice was a series of trade-offs, a quiet balancing act between simplicity, safety, and weight.
Let's talk more about Sergei Korolev, the chief designer. His story is so central to this entire endeavor. The fact that he was able to lead the Soviet space program to such historic achievements, while his own past as a political prisoner was a state secret, is almost unbelievable. He was a man of immense contradictions. He was known for his brilliant, visionary ideas, but also for his fearsome temper and his incredibly demanding management style. The engineers and cosmonauts who worked for him were both terrified of him and deeply loyal to him. They called him SP after his initials, and they knew he was the only one who could get things done. He had a deep and almost fatherly affection for the first cosmonauts, especially Gagarin. He knew the immense risks they were taking, and he felt the weight of their lives on his shoulders. On the morning of Gagarin's launch, Korolev was reportedly suffering from intense anxiety and heart palpitations. He supervised the countdown from a bunker near the launch pad. After Gagarin was safely in orbit, Korolev's voice on the radio, usually so commanding, was filled with a quiet, paternal warmth. He called Gagarin "my little eagle." Korolev's own dream was to send humans to the moon. He designed the massive N-1 rocket, the Soviet counterpart to the American Saturn V. But his program was plagued by internal rivalries and a lack of funding compared to the Apollo program. And then, tragically, Korolev died suddenly in 1966 during a routine surgical procedure. He was only 59 years old. His death was a devastating blow to the Soviet space program, and many believe it was the single biggest reason why they never made it to the moon. It was only after his death that his true identity and his immense role as the father of the Soviet space program were revealed to the world. His story is a quiet reminder of the immense human drama that was happening behind the scenes of the space race.
Let's think for a moment about the world that Gagarin saw. In just 108 minutes, he crossed oceans and continents, day and night. He was the first person to truly see the planet as a whole, a single unified system. And his descriptions, radioed back to Earth, were filled with a profound sense of wonder. He was particularly struck by the colors. He talked about the beautiful aura of the atmosphere, the way it shifted from a delicate blue to a deep violet and then into the black of space. He described the surface of the Earth as having very vivid, very beautiful colors. He saw the coastlines of continents, the green of forests, and the yellow of deserts. He was the first human to witness an orbital sunrise and sunset, and he described them as being incredibly rapid and brilliant. His perspective was unique. He was a test pilot trained to be a calm, objective observer, but he was also a human being, experiencing something no one had ever experienced before. His transmissions are a wonderful mix of technical reports, "The flight is proceeding normally, I am feeling well," and bursts of pure poetic awe. "The sky is very dark, the earth is bluish, everything is seen very clearly." This new perspective the overview effect, as it would later be called, is one of the most enduring legacies of his flight. The images and descriptions that he and the astronauts after him brought back changed the way we think about our own planet. For the first time, we could see our world not as a collection of countries on a map, but as a single, fragile, beautiful ecosystem, a small, precious home floating in a vast and empty cosmos. Gagarin was the first messenger of that new consciousness.
Let's now consider the immediate aftermath of Gagarin's flight, his transformation from a secret cosmonaut into a global superstar. After being recovered from his landing site, he was flown to Moscow for a hero's welcome. The celebration was a massive, state-organized event. He was driven through the streets of Moscow in an open car, greeted by millions of cheering people. He stood atop Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square, next to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, as military parades marched in his honor. He was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. He had become, overnight, the most famous man on Earth. But this fame came at a cost. He was now seen as a living national treasure, a symbol of Soviet achievement too valuable to risk on another space mission. While he desperately wanted to fly again, perhaps to the moon, he was largely grounded and pushed into a role as an ambassador and a politician. He embarked on a world tour, visiting dozens of countries, and he was, by all accounts, incredibly charming and effective in this role. His humble origins and his warm, easy smile won over people everywhere he went, from London to Havana. He was a powerful symbol for the Soviet Union, a human face for their technological prowess. But the pressure of this global fame was immense. He was a young pilot from a small village, and he was now one of the most recognizable people on the planet. He reportedly struggled with the transition, with the constant attention and the political demands of his new role. The quiet, focused world of being a test pilot had been replaced by a whirlwind of public appearances and state functions. The man who had achieved the ultimate solitude in orbit was now never truly alone.
The tragic death of Yuri Gagarin in 1968 cemented his legendary status. On March 27th, he was on a routine training flight in a MiG-15 fighter jet with a flight instructor. The exact circumstances of the crash have been debated for decades, shrouded in the same kind of secrecy and speculation that surrounded his life. The official investigation concluded that the jet had likely gone into a spin after an encounter with a weather balloon or a flock of birds. But many other theories have been proposed over the years. Some have suggested a failure of the plane's equipment. Others have pointed to the turbulence from a larger, supersonic jet that might have been flying too close. Some more conspiratorial theories have even suggested foul play, though there is no credible evidence for this. What is certain is that the crash was a devastating loss for the Soviet Union and for the world. The first man in space was gone. His ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall, a place of honor reserved for the greatest heroes of the Soviet state. But his legacy is much larger than any monument. He remains a powerful symbol of human courage, of the quiet determination to push the boundaries of what is possible. He was not a scientist or a great political leader. He was a skilled pilot with a calm demeanor and a warm smile who was given the extraordinary opportunity to be the first to see our world from a truly new perspective. And he carried that immense responsibility with a simple grace that captured the imagination of the entire planet. And with that, we have explored the true, complex, and deeply human story of the first man in space. A story of incredible achievement, of quiet near disaster, and of the powerful myths that grow in the shadow of great secrets. It's a story that is, in its own way, as vast and as fascinating as the sky he so briefly visited.
Let's take one last quiet look at the Vostok 1 capsule.
His little swallow. After its rough, fiery landing in that Russian field, the scorched spherical module was recovered and became a treasured historical artifact. Today it is on display at a museum just outside of Moscow. It is surprisingly small, a tiny, cramped ball of metal. When you look at it, you can truly appreciate the incredible bravery it took to be strapped inside it and launched atop a converted intercontinental ballistic missile. The interior is a time capsule from the dawn of the space age. The simple control panel, the strange mechanical globe, the ejection seat, it all speaks to a different era of technology, an era before digital computers, where complex problems were solved with clever mechanical systems and an immense amount of human courage. It's strange to think that this small, scorched sphere is the first vehicle that ever carried a human being away from their home planet. It is the Mayflower, the Santa Maria, the Wright Flyer of our cosmic journey. It represents a fundamental turning point in the history of our species, the moment we first dipped our toes into the vast ocean of the cosmos. And that is a wonderful thought to end on. The story of Yuri Gagarin and Vostok 1 is not just a story from the Cold War. It is a story that belongs to all of humanity. It is a story about a single individual who, for a brief 108 minutes, represented our entire species, carrying our collective hopes and our boundless curiosity with him into the great silent unknown. It's a testament to the idea that even the grandest journeys begin with a single small step, or in this case, a single quiet orbit.
As we conclude our long exploration tonight, let's reflect on the nature of these stories. We have the official history, meticulously documented in flight plans and declassified archives, a story of brilliant engineering, immense risk, and triumphant success against the odds. And then we have the other history, the ghost story, the folklore, a story of secret tragedies and lost souls, whispered in the static between worlds. Which story is more true? In a factual sense, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the official history. The lost cosmonaut theories are compelling tales, but they remain just that, tales. But perhaps they hold a different kind of truth. They are true in the sense that they reflect the deep anxieties and the profound sense of mystery that surrounded the space race. The secrecy of the Soviet program was a real and powerful thing, and it created a space for these myths to take root and grow. They are a kind of historical echo, a reflection of the fears of the time. Thinking about these parallel stories is a quiet way to think about how we create history itself. History is not just a collection of facts. It is a narrative that we build. And sometimes the myths and legends that we tell ourselves about an event can become just as much a part of its story as the event itself. The legend of the lost cosmonauts is now, and will likely forever be, intertwined with the true story of Yuri Gagarin's flight. It is the ghost that haunts the beautiful machine. And contemplating that duality, the known and the unknown, the real and the imagined, can be a deeply soothing exercise. It reminds us that the world is a complex and often mysterious place, and that there is always more to a story than what appears on the surface.
Let's think one last time about German Titov, the man who was Gagarin's backup. He was, by all accounts, just as qualified, and perhaps even more skilled in some areas. He was heartbroken not to be chosen for the first flight.
but history had a different role for him. Just a few months after Gagarin's flight, in August of 1961, Titov flew the Vostok 2 mission. His mission was much more ambitious and, in many ways, a much more challenging scientific flight than Gagarin's. While Gagarin had completed a single orbit, Titov was tasked with spending a full 24 hours in space, completing over 17 orbits of the Earth. He was the first person to spend a full day in orbit, the first person to sleep in space, and, unfortunately for him, the first person to experience the debilitating effects of space sickness. His mission was a crucial scientific step, gathering vital data on how the human body reacts to prolonged periods of weightlessness. But because he was second, his name is not as famous as Gagarin's. He is a quiet figure in the shadow of the first. It's a poignant reminder of how history works. The first is always remembered, but the progress of science and exploration is built on the quiet, dedicated work of all the seconds and thirds who followed, expanding the boundaries of what we know, step by patient step. Titov's mission was, in many ways, a more significant scientific achievement, but Gagarin's will always be the more significant human moment.
The legacy of the Vostok program as a whole is immense. It was a program of incredible firsts. It sent the first satellite, the first animals, and the first man and woman into orbit. It was a program that consistently beat the American space program to major milestones in its early years, driving the U.S. to create NASA and ultimately to commit to the audacious goal of landing on the moon. The Vostok rocket itself, the R-7, is a legend of reliability. In its modern, updated forms, it is still in use today. Every Soyuz spacecraft that carries astronauts and cosmonauts to the International Space Station is launched on a rocket that is a direct descendant of the one that carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit over 60 years ago. It is the most successful and long-lived rocket design in human history, a quiet testament to the genius of Sergei Korolev and his team. And the Vostok capsule, that small scorched sphere, remains a powerful symbol. It represents a time when the world was divided, but humanity was united in looking up at the sky with a sense of shared wonder. It represents the idea that even in the midst of intense political rivalry, great things can be accomplished. It's a story about the dawn of a new age, the moment our species finally took its first tentative step off our home planet and into the vast, silent ocean of the cosmos. It was a single, small orbit, but it was a leap that changed our perspective on our world forever.
And so, we bring our long and detailed story to a close. We have journeyed back to the very beginning of human spaceflight, to a time of immense secrecy, incredible risk, and profound, world-changing achievement. We've met the brilliant, haunted chief designer, the brave and stoic space dogs, and the quiet, charismatic young pilot who became the first human to see the Earth from above. We have explored the incredible engineering of his tiny spacecraft, the near disaster of its fiery return, and the strange, humbly circumstances of its landing in a remote field. We have also waded into the murky, static-filled waters of Cold War mythology, listening to the ghostly whispers of the lost cosmonauts, and examining the powerful legends that grew in the void left by official secrecy. We have seen how history is not a single clean narrative, but a complex tapestry woven from threads of fact, memory, and myth. I hope this quiet exploration of the past has been a soothing one.
The story of Yuri Gagarin is, I think, a perfect story for the end of a long day. It is a story of a single human being facing the immense unknown void with a quiet courage and a warm smile. It's a story that puts our own small earthly problems into a grander perspective. So, as you get ready to drift off to sleep, let the image of that small spherical capsule, glowing as it re-enters the atmosphere, be a comforting one. It is the story of a safe return from an incredible journey. Let the quiet courage of that first cosmonaut be an inspiration. Sweet dreams.